And there we go. I remembered to hit my button. I'm also going to record this session, so if you would like a copy of it or any of our other recordings after this, just let me know. My email address is on the screen, and I'll have this slide up again at the end. We'll be happy to provide you with recordings of stuff. Throughout this session, you are most welcome to interrupt with questions. There's so few of us today. It's a great opportunity for us to really customize and make this useful to you. So don't hesitate to do that. If you would like to just holler on the phone line, that works fine, since, again, not very many of us. But if it's easier, you may want to just type it into the IM, the instant message panel on your link screen. That'll allow me to take the questions as they fit into the rest of the presentation. I don't care. It's up to you. So let's get going. We're going to just do the basics of Scrum. How do you do it? What is it? What's it about? And we'll just get started. Why do you want to do Scrum? Why would anybody want to do Scrum? Well, it looks like a pretty fair number of people want to do Scrum already. This is a study that's actually from, let me get the user pointer, 2009. So it's not even the most up-to-date of the studies on Agile adoption. The numbers are even more in favor of Agile and in favor of Scrum today. I've seen a thing, but it's not as awesome a chart as this, so I haven't used it yet. I tell everybody in my presentations this is my absolute favorite graphic, and the reason is a couple things. It shows that Agile is really clearly winning in terms of the self-reported methodologies that industry is using, but it's not just that the plurality of folks are using some form of Agile. It's also this fact right here, which is the thing that Agile is winning over is not waterfall. Waterfall is way down here, and very few people admit to doing it on purpose. Most people don't intend to do waterfall. Most people do this other thing in red here, which is, and that of course is the most reported of all of them, is that they don't have a methodology or a particular structure that they're following. I see this as meaning potentially a couple of things. One might be, help, we don't know what we're doing at all, this is a mess. And the other one might be, we've made up something that's very unique and particular to us. And maybe that is working and maybe it isn't, right? But in any case, Agile is clearly winning in software development, and among Agile implementations, Scrum is the most popular, but there are lots of other choices. They all really boil down to very similar things. So let's talk quickly about why teams might choose to do Scrum in particular. In some of our other talks, we talk about the overall principles of Agile, and those are also important. But at this point, we assume that, we're doing Agile, and why do we want to choose Scrum in particular among all the other Agile methodologies that exist? Scrum is very structured. It offers a lot of detailed guidance, and it is built around measurability. It was created to be an empirical method of delivering software, and so it has a few practices in it that make it itself highly measurable, and you're measuring your own team's performance, and you're working on relative improvements of your own team's performance. So that's a strength there. It's not something where objective standards are being imposed from outside. Those are always difficult to meet. You end up having, once you are established with Scrum, you end up having a high degree of predictability in your process. Because again, you've based it on the numbers of your own team, your own situation, the software that you are developing in your culture. And once you've figured out how your team performs in that environment, you have a baseline to make really, really solid predictions of how they're going to perform in the future. With any Agile implementation, and in Scrum in particular, you're trying to improve your cost benefit and your return on investment in software. And what this means is, Agile is about doing things in much shorter iterations than we are used to. Even though the software that we're developing seems big and we know it's going to take quite a while to get it all done, we're going to break it down into tiny pieces and deliver those as quickly as possible for a number of reasons. The first and most important reason, I think, is this one at the bottom, which is that we want to get it in front of our customers for feedback and find out what is wrong with it as quickly as possible. Because we know that there are things wrong with it. No matter what we've done to try to put everything in contracts and sign things with all kinds of legalese, and we've gotten the customer to promise us 7 different ways that they're never going to change their minds about what they want to do. They're lying. And we're lying too. We're going to learn things as we go that are going to change our estimates and are going to change the situation that we find ourselves in. And we want to be able to pivot frequently, adjust to those situations, and be able to still deliver something of value successfully. That's what Agile is all about. That's some of the stuff that is the hardest, but it is also the most valuable. This is where you're going to get really strong productivity gains from delivering little bits faster, getting quick feedback on them, fixing and adjusting when you need to, and also being able to say at any point along the process, you know what, we said it was going to take a year, but we've worked on it for 8 months, and the thing we have is pretty valuable, and this is good enough. And we can move on and now deliver a different thing. So you're not locked in a couple of different ways. Hey, this is valuable enough, and we've got this other awesome opportunity. Let's go follow that. All of those are reasons to get Agile and also reasons to do Scrum. All right. I'm going to take these. So I'm seeing some annotations pop up on the page, and I haven't figured out how to turn those off for you guys, but I'd love it if you would just resist the temptation to play with the annotations. All right. Components of Scrum. We're going to be talking today about Scrum as it is implemented by the scrum.org Scrum Guide. Scrum was created back in the 1990s. Yes, the 1990s, by Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland. They are now both with Scrum.org and still producing wonderful new case studies and refinements and guidance, and there's a great community to be found there. And all of what we're going to be talking about today, you can go grab the Scrum Guide from Scrum.org, click on the link to guide, and it'll take you to this really surprisingly short document, 16-page PDF, generous margins, that describes the core components of Scrum, and these are them. This is it. I cheat and I add an extra one because they don't specifically say that the definition of done is an artifact or a role or whatever, but it is a core component of Scrum. So I say that there are 11 and a half things that make up the core practice of Scrum. So this is where we start to really differentiate Scrum from other Agile practices. Scrum is a framework, and when I say framework, I want you to kind of think of a scaffolding or the framing of a house where you've got a structure that is made up of several pieces and they all fit together. And you are going to build your detailed practice around that framework. So the framework itself is not the whole house. It's not all the walls and stuff. It's just a shell, but it's the shell that you put all the rest of your practices in. And the reason that's important is that in Scrum, we don't really want so much to pick and choose particular things out of the Scrum Guide and do them in isolation. They work better when you do them all together. Some folks interpret that as being religious or zealous. But the idea is not to say that this is the one true way or whatever. It's that these pieces have been designed to work together. The case studies, the examples, the evidence from folks who've been using Scrum successfully involves these things working together. If you skip some of them, they don't work as well. You can do it, and if you find that it works for you, great. But you won't be doing really the core of Scrum. You might be doing something else. You might be doing a version of Agile that is more flexible. That might work for you. So that's okay. We're not, it's not about a value judgment. It's just saying the point here, if you want to do Scrum, is to understand how all the pieces work together. So we're going to be digging into each of these categories. The roles, we'll talk about what all these roles are, the different events, what we do in each of the events, and what the artifacts are about, what they're made up of. So let's just jump in and we'll do that. Again, don't hesitate to hit the IM panel or unmute or whatever on the phone, and let me know if you have questions as we go. So let's start with the roles. Who are we talking about in Scrum, and what does it mean that these are roles? First of all, it's important to note that all the things we say about the Scrum roles, and the product owner is a great place to start with this, is these are not job titles. They're not job descriptions. These people have a job title with your organization that is something else. The product owner is a role. It's a hat. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be exclusive. In a product owner, you can only have one person who is the product owner, but the person who is the product owner can do a bunch of other stuff on your team, as long as they are fulfilling all the needs of the product owner role. So if you have very small teams, you can have individual people doing multiple roles if that makes sense, if they have time to do it. So, and the product owner can be absolutely anybody with absolutely any job title. A lot of times we think of them as being your traditional project manager is going to move into this role, and that might be a great fit. But it might also be that you have a business analyst who is particularly suited to be the product owner, or a developer, or a tester. It's really who can do the work that a product owner role requires. Let's talk about what that is. The product owner, first and foremost, needs to be one single person. I believe the Scrum Guide calls it the single ringable neck. And the reason that you have to have that is that the most important function of a product owner is accountability. They are the person who sits between your stakeholder and your development team and negotiates between the two of them about what the work is going to be that's going to get done. And they make the decisions about what order the work gets done in, what is available to the team to select to put in a sprint. And they represent the customer when explaining what the thing is supposed to do. And so ultimately they are accountable to the customer for satisfaction in terms of, did we deliver the right thing? And also, did we deliver the right things in the right order? Did we deliver you value that you wanted at this time? So I'll tell you a story about product owners. I have a friend of mine, a former colleague from my former life as a developer, who, since I've joined Northwest Cadence, sent me an instant message one day and said, hey, I hear you do Scrum stuff. I got a question about Scrum. We're doing Scrum in our organization. And he's kind of fallen into a Scrum Master role, which we will talk about next. And he said, we're having this real struggle on our team that we're delivering stuff in sprints and we're delivering all kinds of software, but our product owner is never happy with us. They don't seem to buy into the value that we're delivering, even though we're producing lots of software. He said, can you help me with this problem? And I said, well, but if the product owner doesn't think you're delivering value, then how come the product owner is putting non-valuable stuff at the top of the backlog? And he paused for a minute and he said, and I said, who's picking your sprint items to be worked on? And he said, the development team. And I said, okay, so you've uncovered your own problem. Have a nice day. And so the important thing here is a lot of times the technical team is used to driving the decisions about what's going to get worked on next. And in Scrum, that has to change. It can be very difficult to change that tendency to say, well, we're going to need one of these things first. The product owner and the customer have to say, nope, this feature is the most important and it needs to get built first, period. And that might mean that you need to negotiate with the team and say, well, this doesn't fit in the size of sprints we've chosen. We need to deliver a smaller version of it, but it still has to have customer value. The product owner is the negotiator in all of those discussions. They take the feedback from the development team, and they need to deliver to the development team enough that the dev team can produce software effectively. So they do have to be accountable to both sides. But ultimately, if the customer's not happy with the value being delivered, that's on the product owner. That's why it's so important that they can't be a committee. They can't share that role. There can't be multiple people, because it's way too easy for them to escape that responsibility and imply that it's the other person. All of this is about accountability. This can be really difficult to do in an organization because not all organizations are set up for that kind of transparency or for that kind of person to own that decision. It doesn't mean we're going to fire them when the customer's not happy, but it does mean the product owner needs to be the one to go and listen and take responsibility for, okay, how do I fix that and make the customer happy? Okay. I mentioned on the slide here as well, it's real important that the product owner understand the thing that they have absolute control over is what gets delivered in what order, not how it gets written. They don't even really control exactly what it does or what the rest of the process is. They're just saying, do this feature first. That's it. All right. The other work of the product owner, a lot of times folks assume that the product owner is the only person who can write the stories, write the acceptance criteria, write the test cases. That's not necessarily true. The product owner can delegate that work out to any business analysts or other team members. There we go. And so the actual writing of the stories could be anybody on the team, but the product owner needs to know enough about what's in them to be able to reassure the customer, to be accountable to the customer that it's the right stuff. Alrighty, let's talk about the development team next. I haven't intentionally not talked about the Scrum Master yet. Let's talk about the dev team. First of all, development is not my favorite word that they use here because it implies that the team is just made up of developers, and that implies that it's just made up of coders, and that is not necessarily true. The development team, it specifically will tell you in the Scrum Guide, needs to contain all of those skill sets that are necessary to deliver whatever your deliverables are. And so I think in our real Agile world, we probably want that to include analysts, testers, both folks who plan tests and who execute tests, and coders. Maybe other folks too. You may need infrastructure people. You may need DBAs. You may need, there are other things you may need depending on what your technologies are. So that's, to me, the most important first thing, is that your dev team should be all the skill sets that you need. You don't have to have all skill sets represented in each individual person. You can have a mix of people who have different specialties. That is okay. The team is going to be small. The development team as a whole should be about 6 people, plus or minus 3. So you can have as few as 3, as many as 9. When you get beyond that, you're going to have a lot of difficulty making the stuff you have to do for Scrum work. It doesn't scale very well. But with a team of this size, and so you may break into multiple teams if you need to, and have those teams coordinate using an overall some kind of portfolio management. Within the team, the way that they do their work should be very democratic, should be very self-organizing. The team should decide how they're going to tackle the problems that the product owner has set before them. So they've got their visibility into the backlog, things that you need to listen to the development team about, things that a lot of times get missed. Stuff in the backlog needs to have enough information for them to understand what they're supposed to do. And if they're telling folks that it doesn't have enough information, then you either need to not put so much detail in at the end when you do your sprint reviews, right? Like maybe this is a first pass and maybe it doesn't need to have every little thing. Or if it really has to have every little thing, then somebody's got to write that in and tell the dev team before they do it. There are some techniques that work really well for this that are outside of Scrum, things like acceptance, test-driven development, other strategies that you can use with your BAs, your product owner, your customers, to make sure that the development team knows what is it supposed to do, what are we going to be measured against at the end of this sprint to know whether we were successful or not. Once you have that in place, everything else really needs to be at the discretion of the dev team. They need to have a lot of latitude to figure out how it's going to work. Really burdensome regulations or, enterprise standards are important in a lot of places, but when they are, when there's more to them than is strictly necessary to deliver software successfully, that can slow the team down and make things really difficult. So if they're having to be accountable to lots of other people besides the customers, it's good for the product owner and the project manager to step in and try to figure out how to organize around that to give them a lot more flexibility in how they deliver software. That's going to be a win for your whole organization because it's going to promote innovation and also a lot of job satisfaction among the folks on these teams. They want to be creative. They want to deliver innovative solutions. Alrighty. We've got some new folks on the phone. I am going to see if I can mute everybody. There we go. Hopefully that's working. All right. There we go. All right, folks, I have muted your microphones so that we're not picking up that extra background noise, so don't hesitate to use the IM panel if you need to ask a question. Great. Okay, the team is accountable to each other for the success of the delivery, and it's important to get their heads in that space, get them to understand that they should rely on each other and report to each other and help each other as to whether they're delivering the stuff that they've committed to in the sprint. Finally, we'll talk about the Scrum Master. I think my key advice for the Scrum Master is that less is more. The Scrum Master's sole job really is to know what the rules of Scrum are and make sure that the team is following them. And so they do that by nagging. They just remind people constantly that the framework of Scrum calls for you to do Scrum this way. It is a real temptation, and so this is where you get, sometimes you'll have devs in a leadership role or just devs who are have that sort of drive or leadership quality, or you may have PMs or product managers that are stepping into the Scrum Master role. All of that is fine. Again, this is just a hat. But it is really important for the Scrum Master to understand that it's not about them and that they got to get out of the team's way. They need to protect the development team and allow the development team, or in some cases, push the development team to self-organize and solve their own problems. You are not just trying to build a team that knows how to follow rules. You're trying to build a team that solves its own problems so that when a new problem comes up, they don't need an outsider to solve it for them. They will solve it themselves and feel empowered to do that. So if the team is really looking to the Scrum Master for answers, it's important for the Scrum Master to have some self-awareness, recognize that, and get out of their way. It can be very tempting as a Scrum Master, and I know because I've done it, to try to tell the team how to solve the problem. And that's not what you want to do. You want them to learn their own way. That may mean that they solve it wrong, that I don't like the way they chose to solve it. But if they're delivering value to the customer and their process works for them, we got to let them do it. The Scrum Master should be in more of a service role in the sense that they answer questions, they go outside the team and resolve external challenges or impediments, they get blockers unblocked outside of the team, and they hopefully try to keep the team out of meetings and stuff so that they preserve the team's freedom to do the work that they need to do. So that's the importance of the Scrum Master role. I'll talk a little bit about the dynamics of these roles when we get into the next, the bit where we're talking about the meetings and the events in Scrum, and that'll be in an upcoming section. Okay, let's talk about what it is that we are working with, the items and artifacts and deliverables. There aren't that many of them. The one that is really the most visible, and it's usually the first place that you start when you're getting started with Scrum or really any Agile methodology, is creating your backlog. When you're first starting to create the backlog, it can be really tempting to overthink everything, and it's important to give yourself some space and try to keep it simple at first and not overwhelm yourself and your team. So really you just want to come up with a backlog of stuff that the customer wants. You probably already have a list of what that is. So you want the stuff that they want, the backlog items that they want delivered, and you want to talk about them in a way that is meaningful to the customer. If you have stuff on your backlog that the customer doesn't know what it means, it should come off of the backlog, and it either needs to be rewritten, or it may be that it's a subcomponent of a feature that they want, and it needs to be put back together with the thing that it needs. What I mean by this is, it's very common for development teams to write a to-do list of all the plumbing that they need to do in the back end, presumably to make some kind of feature work. But we've been doing that for so long that a lot of times we just take the plumbing for granted and we just write a big to-do list of what all it is. So for example, if we have a customer who wants something with a web-based interface, we know that we've got IIS server configurations and we're probably going to need a database in the back end, and we start ERDing out the whole database and everything we think we're ever going to need in the database, and then we've got to have some services, and then we've got to build a service bus and blah, blah, blah. And at this point, the customer's eyes have long since glazed over, and we have to stop doing that. We know, yes, it's probably true that a web-based application is going to need a lot of those things, but it doesn't need them all right up front. It doesn't need them all first thing, and we don't do them just for the sake of doing them. We do them because they are necessary to deliver features that the customer is going to want. It's just that we've stopped explaining that that's why we do all those things. So the important thing about the backlog here is that we need to show our work. As developers, when we say this bit of infrastructure is necessary in order to support X feature, we can't shortcut that and say it means that a website needs these 20 things, because we really have to stop and say what is the most important first feature that we need to build, and what is the lightest weight infrastructure that we can put in place that will support that feature. And that's the first backlog item. It's described oftentimes as a vertical slice of functionality, but it may not be the whole vertical. It's whatever the first feature is. In the case of my team, when we first started with Scrum, when we first really got serious with Scrum, we picked a feature that was, we were building a web app for a customer in public sector who was doing a web-based thing for faculty at the university to come online and submit forms that involved calculating salary stuff. And so there was a lot of stuff. The backlog was really long. There were lots of things that we knew it was going to need to do. And eventually it was all going to kind of come down to one really busy page with a ton of report data on it. And if we had tried to build the page as the first thing, that was going to take us 2 years because that's kind of what the time frame was. So instead we picked a single calculation that was going to be necessary on that page. And we knew that the customer was very, very invested in making sure that that calculation was done correctly. So, no, that wasn't the whole system, and it wasn't even something you would describe as a feature, really. But it was a thing that the customer cared about. And they cared, when I say they cared about, what I mean is, if we got it wrong, they were going to let us know, and we were going to have to do it over. That means they cared. So they cared about it. They had a vision of it. There was a right way and a wrong way to do it. And so we picked this one salary calculation. It was something we could do early. And we built all the database connectivity that we needed for it. We built the infrastructure layer, just the classes, the object relational classes, mapping classes we needed. And we built just enough business logic in a business logic layer to do those calculations. And then we built a really ugly test web page so that we had an interface that they could play with. And we put, if you plug in this person's ID and this date range, we will tell you what their salary was in that period. And, well, we could have done it wrong. And so we went through and said, go ahead and test that. And that was our deliverable for the first sprint. Was that value? Was it potentially shippable? Not really. But it was valuable to them because they tested the heck out of it, and they found that it mostly worked, and in some cases it didn't work, and they gave us feedback, and then we made it better, right? And so we fixed the issues with it, and then we layered on the next piece of calculation that we needed to do, which was incorporating something from another database. We didn't build all the databases at once because you need databases. We built only the one that we needed for the thing we were building at the time. That is a big shift for a lot of development teams. That is a place where a lot of folks stumble and have trouble, is trying to find something that you can size down that still delivers value and trying to only build that vertical slice of value instead of building a giant iceberg of stuff underneath. You don't need the iceberg yet. You may need it eventually. You build it when you need it. All right. Again, I invite any questions that you guys may have as we're going along. Do let me know. So the definition of done is a critical component of a product backlog item. I talked about this a little bit before. The team needs to have enough information to know what is going to be considered successful. What does done mean? When this feature is done, what is the customer going to accept? And so you want to have an overall definition of done that has some principles baked into it that are important to your team. And you may have a variety of definitions of done. The first and most important will be the definition of done for the story, for the feature, for the backlog item. What is it going to look like when it is done? This is important even for things like bugs. When you get a bug report in Scrum, a bug is just another backlog item. A backlog item can be absolutely anything, so it's not an important distinction where it came from or why. It's just a backlog item. If it's a bug and it's the top of the backlog, great. You do the bug. If it's, after a couple of features, great. But you want to have a definition of done that doesn't just say this is working wrong, but what's it going to look like when it's working right? What does working right mean? And the features should also be defined in terms of, what is it expected to do? And you will figure out for your teams what the right level of detail is, but it's good to try to take that high-level view of what are they trying to accomplish, what does it need to do. They may be really invested in what it needs to look like, and if that's important for your customers, then you need to factor that in. You need to figure out what levels of detail you're going to have. You may then include mini definitions of done within the team for your team's process. So, for example, this requirement can be considered done and ready to be delivered if the requirement contains acceptance criteria and some acceptance test definitions. That might be anything, and some wireframes attached to it, whatever. So you may have that, and the team says, that requirement's not done. We're not ready to build that yet because it doesn't meet the requirements definition of done. You might have a definition of done for developers working at their desktops. You check in code after you have integrated, gotten the latest version on your local workspace and done all the merging that needs to be done, and you run your unit tests locally, and then you check in, and then your continuous integration build passes all of its tests, then your code for that task is considered done. So you might have one of those. And that would be an agreement amongst the team. The reason you might agree to that sort of practice is so that they are not blocking each other by breaking the build routinely. You may have testers telling the developers, our definition of done, it is ready to be tested when these following things are met, and it's in our testing environment, and you'll tell us when it's ready. So all of those are conversations. Those can be self-organized by your team, but encouraging them to use the definition of done as a tool for communication, that can be really valuable. So I can't say enough about how good it is to have meaningful definitions of done. And it is okay to expand and evolve these over time. You may find that there are things that did not turn out to be important. Don't be afraid to take those out. But let the team really own this, and if it's not working, this is a thing where you would talk about it as a team and make it better. Alrighty. The sprint backlog. So we talked already about the product backlog, and we kind of are thinking about sprints when we are crafting a product backlog. But in reality, the product backlog is kind of that first starting place for absolutely anything. So you don't necessarily have to have the story broken down into small bits in order to get on the product backlog. You just have to have it broken into small bits to get to the top of the product backlog. It has to be small enough. One of your definitions of done for a backlog item may be that you've broken it down into something small enough to fit into whatever length of sprint you are doing. We're going to talk about sprint length in a minute. You want to have the first several items on the backlog be things that are reasonably ready for the team to say yay or nay, this can be done in a sprint. And then you have your sprint planning. We'll talk about that process also in a moment. In your sprint planning, the team is going to look at the stuff at the top of the backlog, and they're going to negotiate with the product owner to figure out what should go into the upcoming sprint. That'll be based on a lot of factors, and your team should care about all of this information. How long is the sprint? What is your team's capacity? Is somebody going to be out on vacation? Is there going to be a holiday falling in the middle? What is affecting the capacity of the team overall for the sprint? And then based on the capacity, how much work do you think you'll be able to do in that period of time? When you first start doing Scrum, your team will freak out about this moment because they have no idea. They have absolutely no basis to know how much work they can do in a sprint except for wild guesses. And a lot of times developers especially will push back against Scrum for this reason. We don't know. We don't know how long this work is going to take. We don't know how to estimate these tasks. We don't know how much we can fit in a sprint. And as someone who's an advocate for Scrum in your enterprise, possibly you may be in a Scrum Master role, you want to talk to your team and tell them, we know. We know that you don't know. It's okay that you don't know. Don't freak out. Just guess, and we'll assess it at the end of this sprint, and we'll see how we did. End. That's it. Now, it will be very, very important to follow that up by not punishing them if they don't deliver enough, quote unquote, enough in your sprint. You need to give them the freedom to take on potentially too much or potentially not enough and see how they learn to manage the sprint. But if you or your boss or your boss's boss is beating up on the team or viewing them negatively because they're not working, they're not doing enough in their sprints, at first, that's going to be incredibly demoralizing, and it's going to make it hard to get the rest of Scrum in place. You won't know at first. Your first at least 3 or 4 sprints are going to be very rocky in terms of how much you take on because you don't know. You are building up metrics that are meaningful within your team, and until you have seeded those with enough data, you don't know enough to go on. But the important thing there is to just stick with it and don't get mad at each other and keep working through the process so that you can build those metrics and learn. encourage your team to pay attention so that when you get into your sprint review, and we'll talk about that, you look back at the amount of work that you've gotten done and you just say, how do you guys feel about this? Was it enough? Was it too much? Was it not enough? And what are we going to do tomorrow in our sprint planning when we plan the next sprint? Oh, let's take more. Let's not take as much. Hey, we didn't catch this thing about that story. Let's make sure we analyze it a little bit more. Let's add a thing to our definition of done, whatever it is. I have a bit of a quibble with this slide, actually. This is an older slide of mine, and I think I need to come back and refresh it. You will notice that, can the sprint backlog be changed during a sprint? It says, no, you can't, but then underneath it says, except when you want to, because really that's what it's about. Here's the thing that can't be changed. It can't, external folks, including the product owner, can't tell the team during the sprint to take on less work, or sorry, more work. They can't add things to the team's sprint backlog without the team's permission. And by permission, I don't mean pressure, right? So the team really has to agree that we can take on more work, we are looking for more work. This is a good opportunity to have the team just pull in the new work when they say we need it, because they may not take enough for the sprint. You may have 3 days left in the sprint, and you've gotten all the stuff done because you undercommitted. That is absolutely okay. You want to have the team have a plan to dip back in the backlog and find something else that they can get delivered that's valuable in those remaining 3 days. So yes, you can change the stuff that's in the sprint, but the development team should really be the drivers based on what their capacity is, not somebody imposing, hey, you guys don't look busy enough, I think you want more work. Don't let that happen, because you want that team to stay empowered. And the product owner is somebody you can negotiate with there, where if you have overcommitted for the sprint, and that happens, you can go back and talk to the product owner and say, you know, we've got this extra story here. We're not really on track to finish the ones we've already started. This one's not started yet. Can we punt this back to the backlog? And if the product owner says okay, then okay. And if they don't say okay, you probably won't get it done. So these are all conversations that need to be had. Alrighty. Remaining work. This is sometimes called the burn down. And this is the only measurement that is really critical to building the metrics that you need for Scrum. It's just a day-to-day measurement, or maybe more often, of how much work is left so that you know, I lied, there's another metric. This is the one that's inside the sprint so that you know whether your team is on track to get the stuff done. And so this is why when you've accepted your sprint backlog, you do need to do the work of breaking stuff down into tasks and giving an estimate of how much time you think it's going to take to get stuff done, or some other kind of relative size metric of those tasks, because then as each day goes by, you say, now how much do you think is left to be done? Okay, how much now? Okay, how much is left now? And that is creating that burn down chart. It's a line that drops steadily off so that hopefully at the end of the sprint, or near the end of the sprint, you reach zero, meaning it's all done. Scrum doesn't care whether your estimate changes from day to day on the same task. Scrum doesn't care what your estimate started out as. You might care, your team might care, because they might use that to learn to give better estimates. So, for example, if you start out with a task that you think is going to take 4 hours, and the day of sprint planning, you've got that tracked as a 4-hour task, you come in the next day and the developer says, I've learned more things, and I now think the remaining work on this task is 8 hours. Scrum doesn't care that it used to be 4. Scrum only cares that the aggregate of the remaining work on that day is some number that is greater than 8. That's all it cares about. So you might encourage the developer to think about, or the development team to think about, when you do your retrospective, we thought it was going to be 4, but we turned out to be 8. What did we miss so that we don't miss it next time? It also doesn't care. Scrum doesn't give any points for effort. Scrum does not care how much time you actually put in on it. So if you said that you had 4 hours to do on that task, and then you spent all day working on it, and it actually took you 6.5 hours, but now it is done, Scrum only cares about the 0. It cares that it's done. Doesn't care that it took you longer. If you took longer on it and therefore you didn't get another 2.5-hour task done that you also meant to get done, and it's still there with the 2.5 hours when you intended for it to be 0, the remaining work is going to tell that story. And that's what you're going to key off of. It doesn't matter how much time you put in. And so Scrum's not really one of those resource measurement kinds of things where you're looking at how quote-unquote productive your team is. That's not your measure of productivity. The hours expended on things is not how you measure them. You are measuring productivity later in the process when you start to think about the value delivered to the customer, because that's what you need to care about. So that's some stuff about the burn down. Different tools are available that will help you do this. Some of the earlier Visual Studio process templates didn't handle remaining work quite as well, but the current ones, the 2010 ones do, and there's some awesome sprint tracking tools that are built into Visual Studio 2010 now. So if you're using TFS to track this, that's very cool. It works well. But there are lots of other products that are out there as well that are good sprint tracking. Alrighty, working software. We've kind of already talked about this when we talked about the product backlog, but a couple of things that are important about working software. That's your end product. It's the only thing that really matters in this whole process. So however ugly it was that you got here, if you got here and you have working software, you have succeeded and you are doing Scrum really well. You just want to figure out, you can improve the process, but if you get this is something not everybody does. So first of all, it has to meet the definition of done, and it's important that you include testing wherever possible. If your organization can possibly stand it, structure yourselves around that done also means tested. Because if you haven't tested it, you don't really know if it really works. And so to me, it is a given that done means that it was both coded and tested. There are still organizations that try to do Scrum within just a self-contained coding team and then throw it over a wall at the end to a testing team. That's called Scrum or Fall or Water Scrum Fall or whatever, that you still have some of these big gates where you're still throwing it over walls. It will be harder to do this successfully if you have to do it that way. You should make every effort to restructure your team so that the testers are part of the dev team as well, and that working software that comes out at the end is also tested. Because if you're not doing that, you're not getting the fast feedback that you need to make Agile and Scrum be really effective. It is not necessary for you to ship at the end of each sprint. You can ship whenever you want. You can ship more often or you can ship less often. And by shipped, I mean sent to a production environment. It's not necessary. It hasn't been for years. We've always said this weird thing called potentially shippable, and I don't really think potentially shippable captures it either. You just want it to meet some kind of criteria that it is in a place where you can get meaningful feedback from the customer, and the customer feels that the thing you delivered has some value to them. We used to call those testable. That was sort of our definition of instead of potentially shippable, we called them testable features, meaning acceptance testable. We had internally tested them. But on the other side of the spectrum, if you're in an industry where you need, especially if you're maintaining, developing on a website, for example, a web app that's in production, you can deploy these changes to your production environment anytime you want, including every day of the sprint if you want. You don't have to wait until the end of the sprint to put stuff in production. You just make a definition of done that makes sense. So, for example, you may have a mix of things. You may have features that you are building for a long-term effort, and you're going to have 2 or 3 sprints where you're going to do reviews, and then at the end of the 3rd sprint, you're going to ship a whole package out to production, and that's great. In the meantime, production bugs may be rolling in, and those bugs might be, their definition of done may include when this bug is fixed, deploy it to the production site. You can have both of those things together in the same sprint on the same backlog. It's up to you. Alrighty. Let's talk about the activities that make up Scrum, because then this is really where all of that mess that I've been talking about comes together. The activities are encapsulated in diagrams that look a lot like this, and you'll see different shapes and sizes of these diagrams, but I always like to say if you see little loopy things, you're probably looking at a Scrum diagram. We talked about the product backlog. You select a sprint backlog. You take that into your sprint. You're going to define sprints. Keep your sprint lengths consistent for yourselves, more or less. Keep them roughly the same size because you want to build up things that are measurable over time. Your sprint length, in the Scrum Guide, it tells you 1 to 4 weeks. 4 weeks is really the longest. I don't like 4 weeks. It's actually a little too long for me. My team switched to 2-week sprints, and they swore they will never go back to month-long sprints. 2 weeks was awesome. because it gets you that nice feedback cadence. Some teams are now doing 1-week sprints, and we have heard of teams that are doing sprints measured in a day or hours. And at the end of whatever that is, you have working software that comes out at the end. Obviously, you're going to size the things in your backlog to the size of your sprint. You're going to scale those appropriately. So if you're working on a sprint that runs in hours, you're probably doing very tiny little things. That's more of a continuous delivery model where you're really cranking through tiny little fixes. Here's what the scaling of the Scrum ceremonies looks like. You have a sprint planning session, a review at the sprint itself, a review at the end, and a retrospective at the end. Those scale to the length of your sprint. So if you have a 4-week sprint, they're 8, 4, and 4. But if you have 2-week sprints, it's 4, 2, and 2. The total amount of overhead is exactly the same no matter what sprint length you choose. It's just how frequently you do it and how long those units of work are. Let's talk about what we do in those. And then that'll be where we'll wrap up and have some questions, time for questions at the end if you are able to stay. So your sprint planning, that 8 hours, if you're doing a month's worth of work, it's an 8-hour ceremony. If it's 2 weeks, it's a 4-hour. Don't skip this. You will find that if you don't do all this stuff in that meeting, you will be doing it at some other time because it needs done. The first part of the sprint is that you at a high level say, we want to try to do these backlog items in the sprint. You may or may not change that as you get towards the end of the meeting. So you don't always have to know right up front for sure. But these are the ones we're going to consider. We think about this many will fit in a sprint. As you're just getting started, you won't know. Just guess. And this is where the team is going to consider. They're going to use their past information. How fast did we deliver last time? How many people do we have this time? Is somebody taking a vacation or whatever? So you just kind of pick those at a high level. The second half of your sprint planning session is going to be devoted to proving that out, meaning you really break those things down into individual tasks. I say that the work should be less than a day for any given task so that every single day you have tasks that are moving from to do into doing into done. Every day you have movement within the sprint. Every day you're burning down stuff. If you have stuff that somebody says, it's day 3 and I'm still working on this, you need to have broken that down into smaller tasks. They break it down in their heads. They do this and then this and then this and then this. They just might not be telling you what that is. So you got to do that work. You negotiate with the product owner as needed, meaning if you get to this point and something breaks down into a lot more tasks or an architectural concern comes up that you didn't think of before or whatever, you find that the story is bigger and more complex than you thought, you go back to the product owner and say, well, we thought we were going to take these 4 backlog items, but in reality, now that we understand how big number 2 is, we think we only have room for 3. The product owner says, yep, that works, or I don't want you to do 3, I want you to do 4 instead, whatever it is. So that's your sprint planning, is setting your team up so that when they get started on the work, they have what they need to work and report back quickly. In the sprint, it's crazy how open this is because the sprint planning, the review, and the retrospective are so structured, but in between, it is a free-for-all. Your team decides how they're going to get that work done. You just want them to get it done and report back on little increments of progress very frequently. So they might choose to do all kinds of different practices that I'm going to list at the end of this presentation. They might choose to do pair programming. They might hate it. They might choose to do TDD. They might not like it. They're going to write unit tests. They might choose to do acceptance testing. They may sit a developer and a tester down together and collaborate on getting this story, getting a mock-up done or building the UI. Whatever it is, they figure it out. They're going to figure it out, and they're going to evolve those processes. Then you have your daily Scrum. It's at least daily. And it's really important in the daily Scrum. I talked about earlier about the roles on the team and empowering the team. A lot of teams are in the habit of treating the daily Scrum as a status report, and it is not a status report. What you are doing is you are reporting to each other on the team. How's this going, and are we on track to get done? It is, to me, valuable, at least at first, that the product owner and the Scrum Master actually just don't even go. Although the Scrum Master might be there to remind them what the daily Scrum is and what it isn't. But it's so tempting for developers a lot of times to look to the product owner and give them a report of, I did this, and you really want to force them to report it to each other because they're accountable to each other for developing what they committed to develop in the sprint. So you want to use techniques that get everybody talking, that get them thinking of it as a report to each other, accountability to each other. You want them to focus on what they have accomplished rather than what effort they've put in. You don't care what effort they've put in. There's no credit for effort in Scrum. But you care about what's left. And when I say there's no credit, I mean, yes, good job, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is what's left, how can I help, where do we need to focus our efforts today, what is blocking us that we can clear. You shouldn't devolve into actual problem solving in the Scrum. You should break that out after the daily stand-up has occurred. You don't have to stand up, but it's nice. The sprint review at the end of the sprint is focused on what you delivered. The Scrum Guide calls it an increment. It's focused on the software that you delivered. Where possible, you need to have representatives of your stakeholders or the customers themselves in the review. If they don't care enough to show up to the review and see the demo of what you have built them that they wanted, then you might not be delivering them the value that they need, and you should make sure you're delivering them stuff that they really care about. They should come to the demo and see something demoed, come to the review and see something demoed that they understand what it is, they recognize it as something that they wanted, and they appreciate that it was done. And that's a good key to you that you're building your backlog with the right things on it. It's good in the review to remind the customers of what your inputs were, what your requirements were. We started with this. We had these 3 acceptance criteria. Let me show you how these acceptance criteria are realized in the software that we built for you. Because if they're giving you lousy acceptance criteria or vague or incomplete, it's good to remind them what you thought you were supposed to build so that they know they need to write it better next time if they didn't get what they wanted. That's part of your feedback cycle. You're actually training them to write you better requirements. Your sprint retrospective, you thank the customers for coming and you shoo them out of the room because now you're going to have your team internally discussing the process, the sausage making itself. How did the last sprint go for you? Did you take on too much or too little? How did the development team's day-to-day processes work? Did you want more testing, less testing? These people work together really well. These folks learned a technique that they want to share with everybody. Whatever it is, it's the team's internal process. You may need to use some discussion techniques to make sure that everybody participates. Stuff like having people, a mix of writing things down so that you don't just have the talkers dominating the whole meeting. You really want to make sure you get everybody's perspectives, even if they're not very forceful about it, because you can learn a lot from the quiet ones. So all of that is where you are, again, you're empowering the team to say, we did great with what we did, but here's what we could do to make it even better. Or here's where, geez, we really kind of dropped the ball. Let's not do that again. Whatever it is. Have a spirit of real openness and transparency and let the team solve those problems without a lot of punishment and blaming. Alrighty. You can add stuff to Scrum. We used to have a thing called Scrum But. Scrum But was, we're doing Scrum, but we're doing this other stuff instead. Scrum is a lot more open now, and we talked about how, especially within the sprint, a lot of the techniques that you may use are not prescribed one way or another. You can kind of do whatever you want. These are some ideas, and I would encourage you, we'll be glad to provide you with these slides so we can go through any of these other details. These are some things that help make Scrum more effective. None of them are mandated by Scrum, but for example, the user story format of writing backlog items, a lot of teams find that valuable. A lot of teams don't like it. It doesn't matter. It's just a tool. I've mentioned several of these other things as potential tools that your team may be able to use to make your Scrum practice more effective. And then here's where I'll just close out with, we talked at the very beginning about Scrum being a high-level framework. We've talked throughout the presentation about the things that are very flexible, that are completely up to you, and the things that really shouldn't be changed. You don't just yank pieces out of the scaffold and replace them with other things and expect a scaffold to hold your window washers up as effectively as if it was the scaffold the way it was designed, right? So try not to pick and choose too much with Scrum. Try to go all in on Scrum. We talked about not undermining the autonomy of the product owner or the development team, not imposing new stuff on the team during the sprint. Don't interfere with them. Don't block them. Don't suck up time that they weren't expecting. Do the ceremonies the way the guide describes them. Do those events the way that it says to do them. You will find that you need all of that time. And don't overplan the items in the backlog. Don't try to have stuff 6 months from now be spelled out at some excruciating level of detail. Agile will tell you that if you try to do that, you will find in 6 months that you were mistaken. It's not worth doing. That's wasted time. So, but feel free to own the things in Scrum that Scrum lets you own, because there's lots of them. There's lots of things that are up to you to do the way that is most effective for you. And definitely encourage your team to take ownership of all of that stuff. Alrighty, so this is the end of the presentation for today. I will gladly stick around for any questions, and I will unmute all of you nice folks. Oh, I can't. Oh, I can't unmute you. There we go, unmuting the audience. And if you would like to unmute your microphone and ask a question, you are welcome to. While we have you here, I wanted to make sure you were aware that Northwest Cadence does offer, if you want to go at a greater level of detail, we have health check services for both Scrum and Kanban. They're a short personal engagement that our consultants will come out and talk to you about what you're doing now and what you'd like to accomplish and how you can do it better. So definitely let us know if this is something that we can help you with. So, thank you for joining us today. Yes, there will be a slide deck available. Email Laura. Her email is right there in the IM window, and she will provide you with a copy of this slide deck, and as well a copy of the recording if you are interested. So, thanks again, everybody, for joining us. I'm going to stop the recording, but I'll hang out if you think of any questions before we go. And have an awesome day.